All right, welcome everybody to this very special seminar here at the School of Divinity. We are going to be launching and celebrating two new publications from members of staff here at the School of Divinity in New College. A book by Dr. David Grumett called The Bible and Farm Animal Welfare, and a book by Dr. Suzanna Millar called Ask the Animals, Developing a Biblical Animal Hermeneutic. This event is sponsored by the Centre for Theology and Public Issues, or CTPI, and it's also a special session of the Seminar for Theology and Ethics and Biblical Studies. So welcome to you if you're coming from any of those particular seminars, and if you're not, then particularly welcome if this is your first time in New College. Thanks for coming along. My name is Dr. Peter Atkins, and I'm a postdoc here at the School of Divinity, and I'm going to be chairing the proceedings today. We are going to launch these two books. Before we do, a couple of housekeeping things. I've got here a register if you're part of either the Biblical Studies or Theology and Ethics seminar. If you're a PG student and you want to write your name on here, it's just for attendance to give you a contact point. If you're not a student, just pass this along and pretend it didn't exist. So if you want to pass that around for me. The second thing is I'm going to go through quickly the schedule for today's session. So firstly, we will hear from Dr. David Grumett, who is a senior lecturer in theology and ethics here at New College, and his research spans fields Catholic theology, the theology and food, and on animal ethics. He'll speak for about 15 minutes, and then we will hear from Dr. Suzanna Millar, who is a lecturer at New College in Hebrew Bible and Old Testament, and her research examines the wisdom literature of the Bible, including Proverbs and Job, as well as animal studies approaches to the Bible. And she will also speak for about 15 minutes. I'll then give a 10-minute response to both of their books and pose some questions to our authors. There'll be a little time for them to respond to my questions, and then we'll open the floor for any questions that you have and would like to ask either of our authors. Formal proceedings will finish roughly about 5:30, and we'll move over to the Rainy Hall, where there will be refreshments and a chance to chat to both of our authors. So, without any further ado, David, if you would like to speak to your book.
So, yes, that's one thing the book's not trying to do. The other thing it's not trying to do, obviously, is to say that things in sort of ancient cultures or biblical cultures specifically were all bad for animals. There is this view, isn't there, that in cultures where there was animal sacrifice, animals were just kind of degraded and sort of pulled into this sort of abyss of violence. Well, it's not wanting to say that at all. In fact, as I will suggest in these comments, there are some quite sort of positive correlations between sacrificial practice and animal welfare. So what the book is trying to do is to draw together biblical material with material from animal behavior and animal welfare science. And it's quite distinctive in this regard. A lot of people working in different humanities disciplines on animals don't really know one end of an animal from the other, it seems, at least not in any detail. There's often a kind of broad advocacy of human disengagement from animals because our sort of engagement with them is viewed as almost necessarily manipulative and degrading for animals. But really, this book is based on the assumption that there are sort of natural interactions between humans and animals. That is part of life, and it's wanting to understand those and how humans can contribute to the welfare of animals. So there are 4 chapters. The first one is looking at animals in their groups, herds and flocks. One of the reasons animal farming works is that the species we have domesticated live in groups. If they didn't, farming wouldn't be viable because there wouldn't be any kind of economy of scale if we could only keep sort of one or two animals or had to keep them all separately. So the animals that we farm, that their group identity is fundamental to our use of them, and we have been able to sort of integrate ourselves as humans into those groups to some extent to shape their behavior. So the animal group that there's most about in the Bible quite obviously is sheep, and they become important as a theological image for the church. Shepherding becomes an important image for what Jesus does and for church leadership. So there's some kind of carryover between the behavior of flocks of sheep and flocks of humans. Sheep, where if they're grazing in a group, they sort of look out for each other, they space themselves. They will raise the alarm if one of them sees something. Sheep groups are also expansive, so they will integrate new members quite well. Whereas pigs and cattle less so. So we need to look at these in terms of groups. Part of this is being aware of natural methods of breeding and rearing. So if you think of a nest built by either pigs or hens, a nest is a very clever thing because it's not a completely solid structure, but it gives protection to what's in it. So a nest with piglets in, or with the eggs of a chicken in, if those are sort of pressed on or sat on, the likelihood is that the delicate thing in the nest will be pressed down through and protected rather than squashed or killed, as is a problem in modern farming on hard surfaces. And think about how the hatching of chicken eggs, there is a synchrony that happens due to actual embryos in the eggs communicating with each other. So these things come through at points in scripture, and so in quite broad terms, the Bible speaks to us in places of the sort of wondrous nature of animal life and how it's instructive for us on the surface in terms of full understanding. Another example is animal migrations. So some of the language in Job about the migrating fish in the orachot, the paths of the sea. So this awareness, even back then, that fish can sort of spawn in freshwater areas, then they can go out on long journeys into the oceans, and then incredibly get back to their same spawning grounds. That's another example of the sort of incredible sophistication of animal species that is identified in the Bible. Moving on to bodies, there is a tremendous emphasis in the Old Testament on the importance of maintaining animal bodies whole, particularly male bodies, because it's obviously male animals that are vulnerable to castration because the genitalia are external and because of perceived benefits for management and sort of meat quality and flavor. But as we know, that time and time again, you get the instruction that animals offered for sacrifice must be entire. So not only does this mean that that males aren't castrated, but tail docking isn't permitted. And this was something that might particularly happen for sheep. Some of you might be aware of the huge-tailed sheep, the Owassi breed, that you can see pictures of these online. They've actually got their tails on trailers that have been made for them, and they're sort of pulled along behind them. So, and animals, that the whole of an animal should be offered to God, and that seems to be for sort of good theological reasons. But I think when one looks for the reasons for these things, there seems to be sometimes a sort of animal welfare logic to it as well. There's perhaps more than one reason for a particular requirement, and they can't always be disentangled. So having looked at this a bit, my sense is that there was a sacrificial logic and the requirement to keep animals entire sort of influenced agricultural practice quite extensively. Farmers like to keep their options open. That's one thing. So if you're not sure whether your animal is going to be sacrificed or not, you may as well maintain that possibility that it can go into that market by not cutting it. Also, if one looks at the maths, and there's been a bit of sort of research done on this, under 1/10 of the sheep required for the Passover sacrifice could have been sacrificed within the temple precincts within the time window permitted. So it seems that actually a lot of animal sacrifice, in fact, the large majority took place in domestic settings. So this didn't just affect the Jerusalem economy and the economy immediately surrounding. It was actually affected the wider ancient Israelite agricultural economy and practice. So then we move on to behavior. I've already mentioned migration, but if we think of the Old Testament in broad sweep, God begins really as a creator of habitats for animals as well as humans, and a provider of nutrition for animals as well as humans. So God isn't a God that needs to be fed, as in some other ancient religions. The God of the Bible is a God who provides habitat and food for animals. So the habitat that animals are in is very important right from the start of Genesis. And one could offer quite a lot of reflections about the importance of habitat for animal welfare, the sort of what's on the ground, the substrate, so things like nesting materials, and what animals feed on. For ruminant animals, feeding isn't simply a means of taking in nutrition. It's how they spend most of their day. So if you start feeding animals concentrate, they then sort of start exhibiting stereotypical behaviors because they have lots of spare time on their hands or on their hooves or whatever it might be. So feeding is an important normal part of animal behavior. It's not simply a means to an end. And there's quite a bit of about animal play in scripture, isn't there? Peter has done some work on this. So the sense that animals are doing things and should be doing things, not just because they're necessary for survival or for human purposes, but because they are part of what it means for that animal to flourish, part of it living a good life. So the final chapter is on stock persons. So I want to begin by saying that in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there is an important principle that animals are separated and distinguished from humans, and animals are not deified. So we have the foundations for appropriate objective dealing with animals. Animals aren't worshipped as deities, as in some other ancient religions. They're not regarded as sacred in the sense that they can't be killed or that their products can't be used. So we have this important, and it seems to me pretty distinctive, ethos of an objective human approach to animals. This doesn't justify exploitation by any means, but we are not to worship animals or idolize them in those ways. So we can use them, but having established that distinction, humans and animals, especially land animals, are are in close proximity in the Bible. They are created on the same day in Genesis 1. So they're literally just standing on the earth beside each other. The nature of the human relationship with animals obviously hugely determines the welfare of animals. Farming, we might rightly see as a vocation. So Luther is good on this, and he imagines Mary milking cows as a sign of her humility. So, as we know, Luther wants to ground vocation very much in the everyday, rather than saying it's something that's just that monks or nuns or clergy do. So farming is a key example of him for that. So farming and zookeeping too as a vocation is something we might reflect on theologically as we look at scriptural material. There are a few suggestions in the Bible of sort of humans becoming animals. This sort of idea that there's a fuzzy boundary between humans and animals is very popular in scholarship at the moment. And it's one that interests me, but against this very clear distinction I've laid out that seems to me characteristic of the Judeo-Christian treatment of animals. So an obvious one might be sort of Jacob covering himself with fur in order to impersonate his brother Esau, to trick their father Isaac into blessing Jacob rather than Esau. You remember this story. So animals are right through this story. So Isaac seems to prefer Esau because he brings back good venison. He's a hunter. Rebecca, Isaac's wife, who takes Esau's side, her name in the Hebrew refers to sort of a group of sheep sort of tied up for milking. Then, of course, Jacob goes away and develops his own herds through a very good breeding program and outwits his father-in-law. So animals are all over the place there, and so humans are tied up with animals, and their destinies are tied up together. Now, in the present day, it seems clear that there isn't as close a relationship between farmers and other stock persons, farm workers and animals as then, because of mechanization, that there isn't the same daily contact, or perhaps almost sort of hourly contact between farmers and animals that there might be more likely to have been then. So this is changing the relationship between humans and farmed animals. But I think the sort of moments of recognition and of relationship between humans and animals in the Bible are quite instructive against this background, and we don't want to lose sight of the importance of that with all the sort of supposed technological advances that there are at the moment. So I will stop there with those few reflections.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time out to come and launch these books. Oh yeah, both sides are, yeah. So I would like to start, if you'll permit me, with a small personal reflection. Earlier this year, a few months before this book was published, I adopted two little kittens. Here they are. This is Coco and her sister Sol. They're named after the quintessential wise men of the Hebrew Bible. Coco for Kohelet, the narrator of Ecclesiastes, and Sol for Solomon, the authorial voice of Proverbs. Coco and Sol, of course, are not wise men. They're not male, they're not adults, and they're not human. And yet perhaps, and this despite their daftness at times, they may still be wise. Spending time with them over the last several months has repeatedly brought back to me the line from Job 12. Ask the animals, and they will teach you, the birds of the heavens, and they will tell you. So this line from Job Can I have the next slide, please? This line from Job inspired the title of this book, Ask the Animals. Part of our incentive for compiling it was the recognition that the wisdom, voice, and agency of non-human animals has largely been ignored in biblical scholarship. In fact, biblical scholarship has, like much of Western academia, been anthropocentric. The Bible has been seen fundamentally as a story of humanity and God, and its non-human players have been passed over as mere plot devices, symbols, or background embellishments. In fact, sometimes the Bible's animals are missed entirely. Its pages are read without once acknowledging their presence. But I found that looking for animals in the Bible is like going strawberry picking or stargazing. At first, you only see a few, but when you get your eye in, you realize just how many there are. The diversity of animals covered in our volume are a small testament to this. Animals, of course, proliferate in the Bible's opening pages. The stories of how God created non-human species, each according to its kind, and then how Adam named these animals, yet deemed them insufficient as helpers, have mythic status in our cultural imagination. In fact, these very stories have often been seen as the root of the anthropocentrism that's dominated Western thinking. So in a seminal article of 1967, which some of you may have read, Lynn White Jr. blamed these Genesis narratives for making Christianity, quote, the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever seen. And Peter Singer, in his famous book on animal liberation, goes even further. For Singer, the same basic plotline from Genesis pervades all biblical texts. In the Bible, he says, quote, there is nothing to challenge the overall view set down in Genesis that man is the pinnacle of creation and that all other creatures are delivered into his hands. And Singer holds that this view has been foundational in his genealogy of anthropocentric Western worldviews. Now, the role of the Bible in perpetuating anthropocentrism must, of course, be taken very seriously. Yet this appraisal greatly oversimplifies the evidence. As the chapters in this volume attest, there is much more ambiguity, complexity, and dare I say value in the biblical portrayals of non-human animals. The recognition of this complexity has been growing in biblical scholarship for a while now, and increasing numbers of researchers are becoming interested in this topic. Many of these researchers draw from the interdisciplinary field of animal studies, a field that's emerged across the arts, humanities, and social sciences, interested in the roles and representations of the non-human players. The editors of this book, myself and Arthur Walker-Jones, felt that the time was ripe to integrate this research into this, the first collected volume dedicated to drawing animal studies into conversation with biblical studies. Our aim was, as per the subtitle of the book, to develop a biblical animal hermeneutic. That is, a mode of interpreting the Bible sensitive to the manifold non-human critters. I'm immensely grateful to the 18 contributors, including our very own Peter Atkins, who collaborated on this volume. Each one of them was a pleasure to work with, and I've learned so much from them. We decided to structure the volume according to a framework drawn from animal studies. Next slide, please. Specifically, drawn from Matthew Calarco's interesting and accessible volume, Thinking Through Animals. Calarco suggests that we can usefully split animal studies into 3 distinct clusters of approaches, those focusing on identity, difference, and indistinction. So I'd like to just briefly explain each of these in turn. Scholars in the identity camp have highlighted the identity between humans and non-human animals, and it's worth saying at this point that humans are, of course, also animals. These scholars have shown that every criterion by which we might distinguish humanity as unique from other species ultimately breaks down. Non-human animals, too, demonstrate intelligence, tool-making, language, morality, and so on, and have many capacities that exceed those of humans. In this way, the human-animal boundary blurs, and identity theorists stress similarities over differences. However, this approach has been critiqued by others who worry that it can lead to an over-homogenization of diverse players. So scholars in the difference camp emphasize not just the differences between humans and animals, but also the many differences that exist between animals themselves and between humans themselves. Some of these lines of differentiation, such as male and female, to take an obvious one, cut across species bounds. Furthermore, an ethics of otherness might be stimulated not because another being is like me, as per identity theorists, but precisely because that other being is not like me. So these first two sets of approaches have as their starting point the distinctions between humans and animals. Then they proceed to either blur or multiply these distinctions. The final set of approaches, the indistinction camp, attempts to reorientate the debate. These approaches attempt to move away from binary modes of thinking altogether and imagine alternative stories and novel modes of human-animal collaboration. So in our volume, we developed our structure based on this tripartite distinction, and we asked our contributors to reflect a little on how their own work fits into the framework, drawing on one approach or another. So we begin, next slide please, with a section on difference, posthumanism and animality, with contributions by Chip Gruen, Robert Seasengood, our own Peter Atkins, Jake Evers and Ken Stone. Next slide please, is a section on identification and animal rights, with chapters by Michael Gilmore, Margaret Cohen, Jamie Waters and Donghyun Jeong. And then finally, is a section on indistinction and alternative stories, with contributions by Timothy Sandoval, Brian Tipton, Jared Beverley, Brian Collier, Anne Letourneau and myself. The chapters in the volume are rich and diverse in their content and method, and it proved very difficult to simply place them in one category or another. Many of them focus on the Hebrew Bible, some focus on the New Testament, and a couple on biblical reception. Some centralize a particular type of animal, so birds, dogs, pigs, donkeys, and maggots all get their space. Other chapters cover a range of different species. Some chapters are experimental, others are more traditional. Following the main chapters, there are responses from a biblical scholar, Bill Brown, and an animal studies scholar, Robert Mackay. Not the same Robert Mackay who works here, different Robert Mackay, but the same name. There's also an afterword in which Art and myself try to reflect on the possible ways to use the volume in the classroom. So rather than go through these chapters one by one, which I think would be impossible given the time constraints of today's session, I thought I'd highlight just 4 issues which recur throughout the volume and which Art and I reflected on in our afterwards. So first, next slide, please. It's striking how many of the contributors engage with disciplines outside of biblical studies. Many make use of research on non-human animals from biology, ethology, and particularly relevant for studying animals in the ancient world, zooarchaeology. Others engage with critical theorists, such as Clarko, of course, but also theorists like Jacques Derrida, Donna Haraway, and Rosie Braidotti. This interdisciplinary engagement is rich, productive, and encouraging, and opens up, I think, real possibilities for collaboration. And I realise that many of you here today are not biblical scholars, so it's my real pleasure to interact with you all from your disciplines. Secondly, the contributors carefully and extensively interrogate the nature of metaphors. It's symptomatic of traditional biblical interpretation that animals are taken for metaphors or symbols of the human condition. Yet some interpreters in this volume reject this approach, noting that it can obscure and devalue the real animals as they're rushed over to get to the metaphorical or human meaning. One contributor, for example, Brian Tipton, employs a neoliteral interpretive strategy, which resists the empire of the sign, and he views the birds in Mark's Gospel precisely as birds. Conversely, though, another contributor, Jake Evers, points out the deep problems that emerge when his case study, which is Isaiah's vision of peace, of interspecies peace in chapter 11, is taken literally. And he advocates instead an allegorical interpretation as being more ethically fruitful. Other contributors note how the structures of metaphors may be unstable. So in Jared Beverley's interpretation of the Song of Songs, for example, he notes the persistent overlap between tenor and vehicle, between shepherd and sheep, such as the two begin to blur together in ontological indistinction. Thirdly, animal hermeneutics, as it emerges in this volume, shares much with ecological, feminist, and decolonial hermeneutics. Several contributors utilize the tried and tested techniques of ecological interpretation in their analyses of biblical animals, and some make explicit appeals for climate action in the contemporary world. Other contributors show how animals participate in the gendered logics of the texts. The ideologies and practices of oppression operative over women are entangled with those operative over animals. Into this mix as well come dynamics of colonization. In 1 Peter, for example, Donghyang Jeong shows how animal imagery is used to the end of colonial dehumanization. Conversely, in a decolonial move, Brian Collier offers Samoan storytelling as an interpretive method to produce a liberative counter-narrative. Fourthly and finally, the sustained engagement with animal hermeneutics may have epistemological and pedagogical implications. The Western education system has traditionally prized the rational logos. A rational-irrational dualism has been constructed, frequently mapped against a human-animal dualism. Nothing that is irrational or animal can, according to this view, be a site of genuine knowledge. This, however, seems reductive. Animal hermeneutics invites alternative knowledges, or alternative stories, as we put it in the volume. It values storytelling, bodies and affect, indigenous knowledges from communities who learn with and from other species. It makes space not only for the insights of the wise men Kohelet and Solomon, but also, next slide please, for the wisdom of the kittens, Coco and Sol. Overall, the book as a whole offers some provisional attempts at answers, but more than that, it invites questions and reappraisals of the texts we thought we knew, as well as those that we had ignored. It offers some early formulations of a biblical animal hermeneutic, which attends carefully to the non-humans in the text. And it takes seriously Job's injunction, ask the animals and they will tell you. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, both of you, for walking us through your books, how you've structured them and what you establish in them. I'm going to offer a 10-minute response to both of your books, which I've had the pleasure of reading, and it's a real privilege to be able to respond to both of them. I will raise 5 questions on both of your books, which are on the screen summarized. So when I'm finished, if you want to address any of these, then feel free to do so, but I'll raise them as I go through. So I think both these books are going to make, and probably already have made, substantial contributions to our understanding of the Bible's relationship to the non-human animal world. And I think they'll provide important groundwork for future study on looking at non-human animals in the biblical texts. It's a great joy to have both of the author editors as members of the School of Divinity here too. Despite the similarity, though, in maybe overall a topic of interest in animals in the Bible, I think these 2 volumes are actually quite different. In terms of focus, I think Dr. Grummett's is more topical, interested in animal welfare in the Bible, and Dr. Millar's is more methodological, looking to develop a new hermeneutic or way of reading. And I think in terms of audience, Dr. Grummett's book is perhaps more accessible, easier for the non-specialist to pick up and read, whereas Dr. Millar's is more technical, looking at some of the complexity of how we read the Bible. And I think those comments are perhaps broadly true, though I think anyone would gain anything or could gain something from engaging with both of these volumes. I'm going to now turn, though, to briefly consider each in turn. So firstly, in Dr. Grummett's book, he focuses on the welfare of farm animals in biblical texts, and in so doing contributes to what is a growing academic discussion about the ethical consideration of non-human animal species in the Bible. And I think this volume's real strength is how it initiates a dialogue between the biblical presentation of farm animals and contemporary animal science to do with their welfare. Such connections, I think, bear significant fruit within this book. For example, Dr. Grumett argues that biblical requirements for animals' bodily integrity when offered for ritual sacrifice likely cause significant positive effects for their farm animal welfare in this ancient context. And I think that's a useful contribution amongst many more. In the introduction, Dr. Grumett states that such insights from the Bible can inform contemporary attitudes to animal welfare amongst both Christian and non-Christian groups. And I wonder if Dr. Grumett would be able to say a little bit more about how he hopes this could be achieved. How would specifically non-Christian groups be informed by this book? How does he hope to do that? I'll repeat a little bit, but Dr. Grumett has divided this into 4 main chapters, as he's already outlined. The first 3 focus on the animals themselves, considering their group structures, bodies, and behaviors respectively. And Dr. Grumett concludes that each of these elements are fundamental to the flourishing of farm animal species. The final chapter, as he said, looks at stock persons, and he suggests the Bible puts a high valuation on responsible husbandry. And each of these chapters engage contemporary understandings of animal welfare within these biblical traditions. This chapter division, I think, is a fairly comprehensive coverage of the material, but I'm left curious as to why this was the division that he arrived at. He's spoken a little bit about it, but I wonder whether this was based on the evidence he found within the biblical texts, or are these based on chief husbandry concerns for animals, or is it a little bit of both of those two things? I want to focus a little bit also on the final chapter, as I was particularly struck by Dr. Grumett's suggestion here that stock persons in some sense can play the role of or become other animals, fulfilling roles such as protection, warmth, or physical contact that other animals within a flock would usually adopt. And he refers to stock persons as being classed as a herdmate with the farm animals, and argues that this qualifies the human-animal separation which he's earlier suggested is essential for husbandry. And I think these insights are really valuable in reshaping how we conceive of ourselves in relation to these farm animals, being one of them rather than completely removed and treating them at somewhat of a distance. I particularly like his reading of Genesis 27 that he's already alluded to, where Jacob covers his arms in goat's fur to fool his father Isaac into believing that he's touching his elder and hairier brother Esau. And Dr. Grumett reads this as an example of a husbandry practice whereby the skin of a dead lamb might be placed onto an orphaned lamb to allow a mother ewe to accept it. So I quite like that reading of the human character also being cast as this orphaned lamb. So I wonder whether Dr. Grumett might reflect on that a little more for us and say something about how that impacts Jacob and Isaac's relationship a little more, and what it might say about the relationship between human and non-human in terms of their sort of relationality, maybe. And staying with this chapter on stock persons, I also wonder whether he could reflect more on some of the stock persons' technologies that are found within the Bible. So he comments upon some of the contemporary developments in farming that separate and remove the stock persons from animals in contemporary factory farming, etc. But there are also hints of some technologies within the biblical text, such as plows or shepherd's staffs, perhaps more rudimentary, but still technologies, and whether those also remove the stock person from the animals. The book finishes with a conclusion that I find to be very convincing. And Grumett states that the Bible has greater significance for animal welfare than is typically supposed. And I think this is a really well-established point throughout the book. A lot of his discussion is focused on how the Bible indicates the welfare of animals should be promoted or protected. So to finish, I wonder whether there are perhaps some examples where animal welfare is not promoted or protected, and are there some examples that perhaps we shouldn't follow within the biblical texts. So to turn to our second book, edited by Dr. Millar, this volume aims to foster dialogue between biblical studies and critical animal studies, as we've already heard, each chapter being written by a different biblical scholar and collectively build up a new animal hermeneutic by which we can approach and read the texts. The exploratory aim of this book allows a range of fresh insights to be generated, and the diversity of fresh perspectives is, I think, quite striking. As the whole collection isn't individually authored by Dr. Millar, I'm not going to look at each of these articles, because I think that'd be quite unfair, but I'm going to look at the shape and purpose of the volume as a whole. And as Dr. Millar's already said, it's divided into a number of sections framed around Calarco's volume, Thinking Through Animals, breaking the various chapters into chapters which use a identity approach, a difference approach, or an indistinction approach. And that division, I think, has a number of benefits in terms of how we conceive of the shape of animal studies and the relationship of the Bible to it. But despite some of these benefits, like any division or classification, it might make some arbitrary distinctions or divisions where none actually exist. And Dr. Millar admittedly reflects on some of this in the conclusion itself, but I would wonder whether you'd be able to reflect a little more on that implementation for us. So why was this the division or structure you used? And do you think it effectively encapsulates the range of animal studies in the Bible? The introduction to the volume, which Dr. Millar co-authors, raises a number of important insights into how the Bible has been wrapped up in issues of our relationship with non-human animals. Dr. Millar and Professor Walker-Jones outline the way in which the Bible, in particular Genesis 1 to 11, has been used to support anthropocentric visions of the world. And the authors, I think, quite rightly outline how this is an oversimplification and suggest that biblical scholars have a critical role in correcting this anthropocentric vision. So the chapters within the book, Ask the Animals, are suggested as being able to add some ambiguity to this vision, some depth, some breadth, and some nuance to this discourse. But I wondered whether Dr. Millar might speak a little more about how exactly it can achieve these goals. So maybe a few examples from the contents that assist in correcting this use of the Bible in promoting an anthropocentric outlook of the world, which is what we might be more used to. After the main sections of chapters, the volume has a couple of responses, as we've heard, which help demonstrate, I think, the book's value and contribution to both the field of biblical studies and critical animal studies. Robert Mackay has previously mentioned is the animal studies scholar, and he states that after the work of this volume, the demand is now to read the Bible for what it says about how so-called animals have, might, should, and will live, and how so-called humans have, might, should, and will live with them. So thinking about past, present, and potential futures. And he calls this a genealogical hermeneutic. And I wonder whether Dr. Millar has reflected somewhat on that idea of a genealogical hermeneutic. Are there ways, perhaps, in which the book begins to point towards a hermeneutic aware of differing or potential ways that non-human and human animals can live together? The conclusion to this volume is, I think, exemplary in its ability to summarize and unify quite broad, different chapters into some really informative conclusions and points for further development. One issue that is brought to the fore is how animality studies within biblical scholarship hasn't really motivated much engagement in animal politics, which might be important as humanities, as we probably well know, tries to develop and demonstrate its relevance for current issues. So again, I wonder whether Dr. Millar might talk a little bit about how this volume might speak into current affairs and appropriately inform some contemporary issues to do with religion and animals. Finally, as Dr. Millar said, the conclusion makes a number of aspirational suggestions for how this book might be taken into the classroom and inform pedagogy. It outlines activities and reflections upon each chapter that could be used as a basis for a session within classrooms themselves. And I think this sort of practical outlook is really commendable. But I wonder, given within biblical studies, how lots of biblical scholars treat either ethical or animal concerns as being tangential or not proper biblical studies, which sort of courses this book might find a place? Where might we find this? So those are my questions and comments. I think after reading both of these, I think both Dr. Grumett and Dr. Millar should be admired for their deep interdisciplinary engagement throughout each of their volumes with various fields incorporating theology and biblical studies. And I think in both their different ways, these two new volumes will no doubt impact and guide the ways people read animals in the Bible, for many years to come. So many congratulations to both of you. So I think if we take a few minutes, if there are any questions that I've posed that you'd like to reply to, then we'll have a bit of time for that before we open it up to audience questions. So is there a question anyone would like to open in addressing?
Yeah, shall I just go through very briefly? Are we doing okay on this microphone? Right. Yeah, I won't take long though. So as you say, Peter, we can open up the discussion. Yeah. So how might the Bible influence contemporary attitudes to animal welfare? Well, we're unlikely to be going there for detailed prescriptions, although as I'm suggesting, there are things to reflect on there. But I think the way that a larger worldview is presented with the world sort of created and gifted to humans by God, animals with an intrinsic place in it, and with recognition that they have their own modes of flourishing that are independent of human needs or uses. That's something that I hope could be taken by a wide range of readers. Why the divisions? Well, maybe I'll answer this to some extent. I think we really need to establish first that farm species are exist in groups rather than individually, and that their behaviors are, so first of all, a result of their embodiment. And then there are some behaviors that seem less directly related to specifics of embodiment. And I suppose I was wanting to deal with humans last. So that's why chapter 4, stock persons, was last rather than first. I really wanted to put the animal center stage and try to understand their physiology and their behaviors before I got on to humans. So that was the reason for the order. The relation between Jacob and Isaac, well, clearly a difficult one. We know that Jacob is mummy's boy, don't we? Whereas Esau with his venison is preferred by Jacob. I mean, I guess sort of Esau, we might sort of say in a rather loose way, is more animalistic. This sort of the hairier twin. So is there something to do with sort of Isaac having a preference for that for some reason? I'm not sure. Stock person technologies in the Bible. So the shepherd's staff and plows. I guess the shepherd's staff, the shepherd is still interacting with the individual animal. They're not, say, putting an electric collar on them, which controls them and just allows them to be out of sight, out of mind for days on end. So I think there are tools and technologies that are more or less effective in maintaining the relationship between humans and animals. On ploughing, well, this is an interesting one, isn't it? Because we might say, well, those poor oxen pulling those ploughs, it can't have been very nice for them, but at least they were alongside humans. So that's one type of human-animal interaction that we don't get now in farming in the Western world, because animals aren't used in that way. Engines are. Instances of welfare not being promoted, well, I guess the flood wasn't particularly good for animal welfare. Bit of a lack of contingency planning by local authorities there. The swine that were driven down into the lake probably didn't have a particularly good ending. So yeah, I'm not wanting to say that everything presented in the Bible by any stretch is good for animal welfare. And of course, whenever a prescription is presented, we can quite fairly assume the reason it's being presented is because it's not always being observed. You wouldn't waste time telling people to do something they're already doing the whole time. So whenever there's a prescription, I think we should be thinking, oh, in reality, that's not happening all the time. That's how I would read that. And of course, animals flood, not just as subject to flooding, but famine and disease. So a lot of welfare problems. And we mentioned the stall-fed cattle as well, which is a sort of specific human husbandry practice. So Yes, the actual welfare outcomes are ambiguous to say the least, particularly if you consider most land animals in the world being liquidated at the flood. But that's not to say that there aren't important sort of principles in the Bible that can be drawn out that are positive for animal welfare.
Thank you very much for the response. Dr. Millar?
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for your attentive reading, Peter. I really appreciate that. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to go straight on to question 2, but we can come back to question 1 on this if you'd like to during the general discussion later, because I think question 2 relates quite nicely to what Dr. Grumett was just saying about kind of anthropocentrism, or negative versus positive perspectives on the Bible, on animals in the biblical texts. What the Ask the Animal volumes is not doing is just saying, hey, look, the Bible is great about animals. Look at all these lovely texts which go against anthropocentrism. It's a much more complex picture, as Dr. Grumett has just outlined. So I think what we were trying to do in the volume was much more just show some of that complexity and some of the nuance, both the negatives and the positives together. There are some kind of more positive examples in the volume. So, for example, in Jamie Waters's chapter on Jeremiah, she talks about the birds and the kind of the high view of birds who know their times, which goes to the migratory patterns that David reflected on earlier as well. Equally, there's a chapter by Timothy Sandoval on human obligations towards animals, which again fits in with these animal welfare in farming practices conversations. So he looks at the book of Proverbs in particular and some of the injunctions, for example, to know the faces of your sheep, or to know the soul of your oxen, and things like this. Which I think also leads on to the third question about ways of humans and animals living together in the world. Sandoval talks about that in this kind of context of domesticated animals. Other scholars, so in Brian Collier's chapter, he's a Samoan exegete, and he looks at indigenous Samoan storytelling and how in that culture, humans and animals do have a more kind of living together mentality. And so he relates that to the biblical texts. Equally, other scholars in the volume draw on Donna Haraway's idea of companion species, which has been quite productive in biblical studies, and the idea of humans as kin. So in Brian Tipton's chapter, he talks about, I think he phrases it, siblings in the peaceable kingdom is the way that he talks about human-animal relationships in that chapter. And I think all that relates into how the Bible might be used in current affairs, which is Peter's 4th question there. And of course, this is particularly going to be relevant for people for whom the biblical text is sacred scripture. So for Jews and Christians primarily, this volume, we hope, will sort of complexify the way that humans are thought about within those human-animal relationships are thought about in those religious traditions. Often, and I find this in my own teaching, that people have a sort of naive view of like, oh, it's all Genesis 1, it's kind of humans have dominion over the animals, and then they kind of stop there in their views of human-animal relationships. Whereas actually there's so much more in the biblical texts. So I think primarily, if we're thinking current affairs, its primary target audience is going to be people who consider the biblical text as scripture, though I think there is also kind of broader implications to be drawn out as well, particularly insofar as the biblical texts have been hugely influential for Western culture in general, regardless of one's own personal beliefs. And I've just mentioned my own teaching, so this leads on to the final question as well. I think Peter used the phrase proper biblical studies in his reflections just a moment ago. And I think there is this kind of impression like, oh, it's not real biblical studies if you're thinking about all these animals, like it's just kind of something fun and tangential. However, I think actually we're at quite an exciting moment in terms of the development of the disciplines, biblical studies, and also TRS more generally, where there is this kind of reorientation and the ideas of something being proper is not self-evident anymore. So I think there is a really exciting opportunity for us as scholars and teachers to reflect with our students about this. And actually, so I'm teaching a course, I've had the great privilege of teaching a course on the Bible and animals this semester, and the students love it. They're so interested in the topic. So it's certainly not the students who are sort of rejecting this. If anybody is kind of gatekeeping, it's not coming from the students. So I'll leave my comments there, and I'd love to hear what you all think.
Well, thank you both for giving us a real window into both of your books and some of the issues that might raise. We've got now about 25 minutes for audience questions. So if anyone has a question for either of our authors, then feel free to stick your hand up and I'll come over with the microphone. Start at the front and then we'll go to
Thank you. I'm Michael Appleby, a retired animal welfare scientist. Mention of current affairs immediately makes me think of climate crisis and sustainability. And it seems to me inarguable that the demands of both animal welfare and sustainability put us in the direction of keeping fewer animals, but keeping them better, which therefore also implies people, at least in the developed world, eating less meat and paying more for it. Do either of you have a perspective on that? Clearly, these weren't current issues in biblical times, but they very much are now.
Well, I was thinking of this just this morning, where, in relation to this rewilding sort of protest, that the notion that the church commissioners should be rewilding 30% of their lands. Now, I don't know if the people think that we should be rewilding 30% of all British farmland, but yes, if we are reducing the amount of crop we feed to animals, and as you well know, Mike, that's what a lot of our crop is grown for in the UK. That will involve rearing fewer animals, yes, and people paying more for them. I guess the increased price would happen just on economic principles, because the supply would fall. But I think on the other side of that, as we sort of well know from some discussions we've been part of, there would be concerns about sort of poorer people and people with less money, nevertheless needing access to meat and animal products. And we've got the basic problem, haven't we, that if you ask people, do they want higher animal welfare, they say yes. If you ask them, do they want cheap meat and animal products, they say yes. And those two perhaps don't go together.
Yeah, I think I had a very similar set of reflections that, yes, we need to be eating less meat as a society, but if the way to do that is to drive up costs, then that's going to set up a new set of barriers, and meat is going to be a privileged possession of the elite. And in fact, it's interesting thinking kind of biblically about this, that was already a kind of boundary marker, insofar as we know from the zooarchaeological records that wealthier areas had better access to meat resources and better quality meat. So even though it's a very particular set of issues today which was not reflected in biblical times, I think we can see this kind of use of animal bodies to set up social boundaries is a perennial issue, I think, and one that needs some serious reflection, so as not to set up an elitism within that.
Rather than luxury or elite, I would use the term special. And in those times, meat was special. You had it on special occasions, killing the fatted calf.
Yeah.
And I think we could return to it being more special rather than routine, both for the sake of sustainability and for looking after the animals as well.
Yeah.
Thank you of the presents, and I really love that. And I'm thinking how both of the words keep relating to the bigger ecological hermeneutics or ecological ethics. So I just want to ask that how the non-human creation, what I mean here is meaning the land or the sea or the sky, being placed in both of the words. Because I just thinking when I'm reading the books, and I just thinking, would the non-human creation, the holy mountain or the meadows, just being the background or the platform of where human and the animals being interacted? Are the meadows just providing nutrition for the flocks? So I just wondering how the non-human creation, I mean the land, is being placed in both of the works.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really important. Switch to mute on instead of off. Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's a really important issue to reflect on. I suppose my mind is going in a few directions. So in this volume is primarily focused on animals, but broader non-human creation also is significant. So Margaret Cohen's chapter is actually about the forest and its denizens, she says. So she is looking more broadly, and she even looks at the kind of the interaction between critical animal studies and critical plant studies. So the way that trees are used in that narrative. Just taking a step back and reflecting more generally from a disciplinary perspective, animal studies as it's emerged within biblical studies is a kind of new emergent discipline, in some senses emerging out of ecological hermeneutics. And so it's kind of stemming from there. And so the ecological questions are very much at the heart of it. And yet at the same time, I think there is a place to differentiate animal studies from other forms of non-human studies. Primarily, I think, because of the sentience issue of animals vis-a-vis other parts of non-human creation. Though I'm aware that that's contested, and how we might discern sentience is difficult. And certain biblical texts seem to reflect the idea that the land has a voice and the land has agency in some sense. So I think there is this kind of blurring. I think it's also important not to just let the animals just get absorbed into the land. So I think it's a kind of both and it's a thing to balance. Yeah.
Yes, so I think for my project, the land primarily features as habitat for animals and as providing nutrition for them. So as habitat, the actual sort of surface and depth of the land is important for animals to sort of peck at, but sort of burrow into, sort of interact with the substrate, but also the soil, the earth, is something that things grow in, and that provides animals with nutrition they need. And also, I suppose, shade from trees that grow, so several different aspects. But yeah, I take Susanna's point about the need to separate the animals and the land. That's important.
Hi, I'm not a biblical scholar. I work in a church, and but I've also got a master's in anthrozoology. I want to kind of follow on with both of these questions. So, following on about animal welfare and meat eating, it does seem that working in a church, a lot of meetings revolve around bacon rolls. So how can biblical scholarship and the work that you guys are doing sort of feed into the ground and sort of change things from the grassroots up, rather than making barriers, economic barriers or whatever? And my second question is about how there's a lot of interest in more than human personhood, and a lot of research into that, which is sort of following into landscape. So as well as non-human animal personhood, there's interest in sort of personhood of rivers, for example. I know there's one in New Zealand and one in Canada that rivers have been given personhood. So I just want to see what the Bible speaks into those things.
Well, on the first question about making this accessible to kind of at the grassroots communities, I think, to be honest, Dr. Grumett's volume is going to be a better place to do this than mine, because, as Peter said, it's a more accessible volume, and so it speaks a little bit more directly. On the second question about personhood, it's a difficult one. There are biblical texts which do sort of, as I mentioned, suggest that the earth has a voice, or so the earth cries out in mourning and lamentation at certain points, for example. Or there's an interesting bit in, I work on the books of Samuel in my own research, and in 2 Samuel 18, there's an interesting bit where the mule has agency, but then also the forest has agency. So the forest eats the people in this battle, for example. And so there are these suggestions. but I mean, personally, in my own reflections on this, I do think it's important to make a critical distinction, as I alluded to before, on the grounds of sentience, because I think it is different to harm a non-human animal than it is to harm a tree. I think there's an important ethical distinction there, which isn't to devalue the tree, but it's just to say that we're doing something different. That's my own view. We could debate that, and biblical texts speak into it in different ways. But yeah, those are my reflections.
Let's carry on.
Any other questions or online if anyone on Zoom has a question?
Mine is a very kind of more small and technical question for you, David, which is interested in the sacrifices and this idea that like just the 10% maybe of the flock or of something being sacrificed. But I'm wondering as to when you follow the story along, it doesn't seem like they're ever sacrificing, and the Israelites never really follow the ways. So I guess it's a question of what is set out as kind of the ideal maybe for the people in the narrative, and then what they actually do. Because I've always wondered and thought they didn't do any of this. Like if they did it, like the nation would have been a bloody mess, literally, and smelt horrific. And I'm not sure it ever was. So I don't know. So in kind of taking the principle of how they did sacrifices, did they ever do them? And does that make a difference to the welfare?
Oh, well,
yeah.
yes, I think they did. I mean, Suzanna will know more about this than I do, and perhaps Peter as well, being Old Testament Hebrew Bible specialists. But one could look, for instance, at archaeological settings and animal bones, and look at the concentration of different species, the locations, perhaps cuts in bones, and take that as evidence that what we read in texts actually did happen. There are non-biblical accounts of animal sacrifice and the huge scale of it. I mean, sort of ancient Israel was a big place, and I think particularly once we get out of our minds the idea that it only happened in the temple, it does seem that it probably happened in a lot of places, including a lot of the time in domestic settings. Is it really that remarkable that it happened? I mean, in ancient societies, people very often did sort of kill their own animals. That was probably the norm. And the net cut, until modern stunning technologies came in the sort of 19th century, was probably the least painful way to render an animal unconscious in order to kill it. So it seems to be reasonably effective for sheep, more problematic for cattle, because they have a secondary oxygen supply to the brain through the vertebrae, which the net cut doesn't sever. So it is more problematic for cattle. But yeah, I think in a lot of societies, local slaughter still happens. And I don't see it as particularly remarkable that it probably happened on a large scale in ancient Israelite society myself. I don't know if our specialists have more to say on this.
Not much, Rod. I mean, you're right. The osteological record of animal bones does demonstrate that they were sacrificing animals, but more at regional sanctuaries rather than at the centralized temple. So we have lots of altars with deposits of animal bones in their vicinity, suggesting that animal sacrifice happens there. Particularly males, female animals were tended to be kept more for milk and dairy products and for breeding purposes, but males were, it seems, but not on the kind of centralized in Jerusalem, slaughtering thousands in one go kind of scale, but in this more kind of distributed sense, I think.
Any other questions?
Thank you. I just have a follow-up question actually to the neck cut. So because you just said it's like the most animal-friendly way to kill them? Is that a reason that is given in the Bible? Because I'm asking that because I just returned from from a trip to Mongolia, and I stayed there for 1 month, and there we killed 2 sheep by cutting the belly open. And first, when I heard that we're going to do that, that sounded barbaric to me, but it took 3 seconds and the animal was dead. And I know with the neck cut, that's not always the case. It can be a very slow death. So for me, my question is from an animal welfare point, is that like justified that you kill animals by cutting their neck? Because there are alternatives, obviously.
Sure, yeah. I wonder we get into this, and this is significant because it obviously opens up issues for how we think about animal slaughter in different religions today, including in Britain, because there are, under retained EU law, there are exemptions from the normal requirement that animals are stunned prior to slaughter for certain religious groups, including Muslims and Jews. So this is an important issue. I think I said that the neck cut was the least painful method available at the time. So I was wanting to kind of qualify it in those terms. I'm doubtful that cutting a sheep's belly, and that's what you're describing, would lead to unconsciousness as quickly. Research I've seen suggests that if a sheep is appropriately restrained, it's about 6 seconds with a neck cut, because there is a lot of blood loss because of where you're cutting. So I'd be concerned about other kinds of cut. But in the present day, I would be concerned about this method in any setting, because we do have modern stunning technologies now which render animals unconscious more reliably and more rapidly, especially cattle. Now, if you go to Muslim majority countries, stunning prior to slaughter is typically the norm. So it's become more of an issue here, non-stun in Britain, I think, because we have diaspora communities. I'm talking more about Muslims now. It's become a sort of identity marker, something actually quite conservative, and that might be viewed as a bit outdated by quite a lot of people in Muslim majority countries. So that's why it's contentious. The issue really is how do you engage sort of religious tradition and commitments with modern scientific understanding? There is a project going on at the moment that I had some involvement in setting up. This is a recoverability protocol. So the idea is that sort of representatives of Muslim groups can see stunning operating in an abattoir, and they can see the first stages of recoverability of consciousness. So the idea is that they can sort of see evidence that stunning is in principle recoverable if you leave the animal long enough, and therefore doesn't kill the animal. The key thing for them is that the neck cut does that, but their concern is the stunning actually does that. So it's quite a complicated area, but yes, it's to do with how sort of religion and tradition and technology interact. It's 3 not exactly small topics. Mike,
time for one last question.
Well, in a sense, more a comment just to endorse what David's been saying on that, but to say that also we should not just consider the method of killing. We need to consider the context, how the animal is treated before and after. It makes a huge difference whether the animals are calm and quiet going into slaughter compared to frightened and bellowing. And that is something affected by compassion, by religious views, but also by development of technologies on how to bring them into the point of slaughter, and also how they're treated afterwards. I've seen video of cattle being neck cut and immediately being inverted, which is terrifying, literally turned on their backs, and then immediately after the neck cut being hoisted up by one hind leg, which will prolong consciousness and pain and the bad effects of the neck cut. So it's not just the neck cut, it's the whole context of killing, which can be positive under religious slaughter methods, but can also be very negative.
Yeah, so just to explain this a bit more for people who aren't familiar with it, the animals should remain in the restrainers, shouldn't they, to allow rapid exsanguination.
The exsanguination and quiet, and in that case, more rapid loss of consciousness.
Yeah. And perhaps a little coda to this. Part of the problem about this in the UK is that whereas the law allows non-stun slaughter for animals that are going to be consumed by groups who require this, in practice, far more animals, especially sheep, are killed using non-stun than go to those markets. So a lot of this will go into sort of wholesale. So if we think of sort of local restaurants, schools, cafeterias, that sort of thing. So there's a sort of murky legal area that no one's ever got a grip on, but I would argue is actually illegal.
Sell some of it halal, so they may as well do it all halal.
Yeah.
And not separate.
And if you're in the UK, there are two main halal monitoring authorities. There's Halal Food Authority UK, which allows stunning, and Halal Monitoring Committee UK, which is more conservative and doesn't on the whole. So when you see meat branded as halal, that doesn't itself tell you whether it's stun or non-stun. What you need to look at which Muslim food authority has approved it in order to infer that. So intersectionality breaks down a bit here. This is an interesting one. We might think, well, kind of respecting different religions, respecting animals, it all flows together. It can do, but this is a very difficult issue for sort of animal welfare specialists and sort of slaughter people in the UK.
Well, I think we'll draw official proceedings to a close there. We're shortly going to adjourn into the Rainy Hall for refreshments. I'm sure that both Dr. Grumett and Dr. Millar would love to have a chat with you if you have any further questions or comments, or would like to have a discussion about any of these issues. Two things to say before we finish. This is technically a session of the Biblical Studies Research Seminar and the Theology and Ethics Seminar, both of which have upcoming sessions. So in a week and a half, so on Friday the 25th of October, is the next Biblical Studies Research Seminar meeting, which will be back in here at 11 a.m. on that Friday, with a paper from Dr. Holly Morse from Manchester University on Seeing Hidden Crimes, Visual Art as Witness to Violence Against Biblical Women. And she's asked me to circulate a disclaimer that this will involve some violent portrayals of gendered violence. The next meeting of the Theology and Ethics Seminar is in 2 weeks, on Wednesday the 30th of October, in here at 4 p.m, with Dr. Timothy Judson from Regent's Park College, Oxford, on dark weeping and light sleeping, whiteness as a doctrine of deformation. And this is supported by the New College EDI Committee, and he'll tackle the assumptions made by white people and institutions in the name of a white Jesus. So do come along to both of those events in a week or two's time. So do come along to Rainy Hall in a minute. But before we do, let's just thank Dr. Grumett and Dr. Millar for their fantastic contributions.